What's up guys, welcome back to another Minecraft video, where today we're going to be continuing our series on the book of 1 Corinthians. Today we're going over chapter 9, so let's get into it. Am I not free? Am I not an apostle? Have I not seen Jesus our Lord? Are you not my workmanship in the Lord? If to others I am not an apostle, at least I am to you. For you are the seal of my apostleship in the Lord. This is my defense to those who would examine me. Do we not have the right to eat and drink? Do we not have the right to take along a believing wife as the other apostles and the Lord's brothers do? As the other apostles and the brothers of the Lord and Cephas? Or is it only Barnabas and I who have no right to refrain from working for a living? Who serves as a soldier at his own expense? Who plants a vineyard without eating any of its fruit? Who tends to a flock without getting some of the milk? Do I say these things on human authority? Does not the law say the same? For it is written in the law of Moses, "You shall not muzzle an ox when it treads out the grain." Is it for the oxen that God is concerned? Does he not certainly speak for our sake? It was written for our sake, because the plowman should plow in hope and the thresher thresh in hope of sharing in the crop. If we have sown spiritual things among you, is it too much if we reap material things from you? If others share in this rightful claim on you, do not we even more? Nevertheless, we have not made use of this right, but we endure anything rather than put an obstacle in the way of the gospel of Christ. Do you not know that those who are employed in the temple service get their food from the temple? And those who serve at the altar share in the sacrificial offerings? In the same way, the Lord has commanded those who proclaim the gospel should get their living by the gospel. But I have made no use of these rights, nor am I writing these things to secure any such provision. For I would rather die than have anyone deprive me of my ground for boasting. For if I preach the gospel, that gives me no ground for boasting, for necessity is laid upon me. Woe to me if I do not preach the gospel. For if I do this of my own will, I have a reward. But if not of my own will, I am entrusted with a stewardship. What then is my reward? That in my preaching I may present the gospel free of charge, so as not to make full use of my right of the gospel. For although I am free of all, I have made myself a servant to all, that I might win more of them. To Jews I become as a Jew, in order to win the Jews. To those under the law I became as one under the law, though not being myself under the law, that I might win those under the law. To those outside of the law I become one outside of the law, not being outside of the law of God, but under the law of Christ, that I might win those outside of the law. To the weak I became weak, that I might win the weak. I have become all things to all people, that by all means I might save some. I do it all for the sake of the gospel, that I may share with them in its blessing. Do you not know that in a race all runners run, but only one receives the prize? So run that you may obtain it. Every athlete exercises self-control in all things. They do it to receive a perishable wreath, but we an imperishable. So I do not run aimlessly. I do not box as one beating the air, but I discipline my body and keep it under control, lest after preaching to others, I myself should be disqualified. So let's get into it. So first of all, Paul obviously is an apostle. And second, he saw the risen Jesus on the road to Damascus, and this is recorded in the book of Acts. And Paul goes on to say that, at the very least, even if others don't believe that he's an apostle, at least the people in Corinth should, because he's the one who went there and preached the gospel to them. He is their evidence that he is an apostle. Paul then goes on to defend his rights, saying that he has the right to eat and drink, and that he can bring a believing wife if he wishes, and that he doesn't necessarily have to work to provide for himself, because his work is teaching them and spreading the gospel. But back to what he says about the wife. First of all, he says, the brothers of the Lord. So, sorry, Catholics, it's kind of saying that Jesus had brothers, like Mary went on to have children after Jesus, which is against Catholic doctrine. But either way, ESV then says Cephas. Cephas is referring to Peter, And we see in the Gospels that Peter has a wife. Paul then goes on to explain that teachers have a right to be supported by those who they teach. And both God and man agree, and through the law we can see that God agrees. By saying, "You shall not muzzle an ox when it treads out the grain," meaning when an oxen is plowing a field, you shouldn't put a muzzle on it so it doesn't eat as it plows, because it is a worker in the field, and so it also should expect a harvest. Just like Paul goes on to say, those who sow should expect a harvest, and those who reap should expect reward. And when Paul was living in Corinth, we see in the book of Acts, in chapter 18, that he was working as a tent maker to provide for himself. Most likely because there may have been an issue in Corinth with the people being skeptical of a teacher who just asks for money. But Paul is saying that although he did provide for himself, he does have a right, and those who come to teach to them do have a right to the church providing for them. And then he also says that even though he does have this right, he's not writing this letter, he's not writing this so that he may get money. He's just writing this in order to say that he does have that right. But Paul has a duty to teach. He has a duty to go on and preach the gospel. He said that if he was doing it of his own accord, he deserves money. But because the Lord told him to do it, who would he be to not tell others? And even though God may have not told us directly, we should still be obligated to preach the gospel. Because Jesus said it in the Great Commission, to go out and make disciples of all nations. And even without that, if we truly believe that this is the truth, and that you can be saved by believing in the Lord Jesus Christ, isn't that unloving if you don't try to tell others about it? Isn't that selfish if you don't tell others about it? So we should always work to preach the gospel to others, to teach others about the Lord. And Paul's reward is preaching the gospel. His reward is being able to preach it for free, even though, since God instructed him, he doesn't have a right to boast. Paul then goes on to say the sacrifices that he makes in order to bring people to Christ. Like when he lives by Jews or people under the law, he lives under the law and lives like a Jew. But when he's with Gentiles and is not under the law, he doesn't live by the law, only by the moral law of God, just not by the Mosaic law. And in the same way, that's one reason why I personally would never get a tattoo. Because if the Lord wants me to preach somewhere where there are Jews who believe it is wrong to get a tattoo, I don't want to be an obstacle for them to hear the good news. I want them to be able to listen to me, and for me to be able to follow their moral law in order to lead them to Christ. And Paul also says that he stoops down to the weak. When there are people who are weak in faith, he stoops down to their level to help them, never backing away from the truth of the gospel or of God's commands, but rather making some sacrifices, maybe doing things less that hurt their conscience in order to lead them to Christ. And that, as Christians, is what we should do. And it's also showing us that we should act in love, even if that restricts some of our freedom, because that is what we're called to do. So Paul knows that the truth of the gospel is amazing, and it is there to help others, to lead them to salvation, and he doesn't want anything to get in the way of that. So he continues to stoop down to people's level, to help them where they're at, but never himself living a life of sin, but sacrificing some of his freedoms in order to help them. Paul then goes on to use an analogy of a runner, and that we should race with endurance for Christ, meaning we should follow Christ in all of his commands so that we may obtain the imperishable wreath, meaning an imperishable prize. Like a runner would get like a big wreath at the end of a race. But we run not for a mere wreath, but for salvation. So we should practice self-control, because even though your good deeds don't save you, we are commanded to do good. You will always fail in some circumstances, but you should always continue to try to do better and to live in love. And Paul then goes on to say that we should run till the end, lest we be disqualified. And we should always run with endurance, no matter when the race starts. Whether it's later in life or in the beginning of your life, what matters is that you start and that you keep on going with the race in endurance. Side note, this would be a really good shirt to wear for like a runner, because even though it's not talking about actual running, it's talking about something better than that. It's talking about your walk with Christ, but while kind of jokingly relating it to running. So on like the front, it could say, an athlete exercises self-control to receive a perishable wreath, perishable prize, or a temporary prize, whatever sounds the best. And then, you know those shirts that when you sweat, it brings an image? You could have an image of like a trophy or a wreath on the front of the shirt that only appears with the sweat, so it's literally perishable. And then on your back, it would say, but I run for an imperishable prize, or an eternal prize. And then you can just have an actual printed on wreath or trophy. That would be pretty dope. I would wear that. But that is all for today. Thank you so much for watching. Have an amazing day, and God bless.